Welcome to An Open Window, a weekly series of television programs from the Berkeley campus of the University of California. An open window on the people and events on our campus, a variety of programs produced by and about our students and faculty.
Welcome to Open Window. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our topic today is Reflection on a Career in Diplomacy, and our distinguished guest is Sir David Hunt, archaeologist, diplomat, writer, and scholar. Sir Hunt's service in the diplomatic corps included High Commissioner of Uganda, Nigeria, and of Cyprus. He was former British ambassador to Brazil. Sir Hunt also served as private secretary to Prime Minister Churchill and Prime Minister Attlee. Joining us in the studio is Professor Emeritus Leslie Lipson of the Political Science Department. Professor Lipson is a leading authority on comparative democratic politics and on British politics. Sir Hunt, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you very much.
If I might begin by asking you, what drew you into the diplomatic service?
A series of accidents. Before the war, I was on the faculty in the ancient history faculty at Oxford, and I joined the army, you see, at the end of 39, beginning of 1940, and it so happened that I served abroad the whole of the war. In fact, for 7.5 years, I was out of England, and so I was getting a bit out of practice, I thought, with my Greek. And at the same time, they had a special entry into at the end of the war, they had a special entry into the Foreign Service for people who had reached such and such a rank in the services and had got such and such a first or good second degree at their university. And so I thought I'd apply for that, and they took me on. Very good indeed, I thought. Very good of them.
And it's not a decision that you regretted in any
No,
way?
no, I've enjoyed it a great deal since then. All the rest was fun too, of course.
In retrospect, what do you see as the most important skills and talents required of someone in the diplomatic service?
Personal qualities, certainly, integrity on the whole. This is one of the things which people will get wrong about diplomacy. They think they're devilish devious. You remember the story, the only bon mot attributed to Louis Philippe when Talleyrand died. Talleyrand, of course, is the archetypal diplomat. And they brought the news to King Louis Philippe, and he said, "Died, has he? Died. I wonder what he meant by that." But it's all stuff, you see. The vital thing in diplomacy, especially in negotiation, is not to try and fool the other man. And another very good point is never try and think what he's got at the back of his mind, because he might not have anything in the back of his mind, or in the front of it, for that matter. But make quite sure that he knows what you've got in your mind. And another point, if I may give a final old man's tip, there is no such thing as a diplomatic triumph. Or rather put it this way, the only diplomatic triumph is one with which both sides are satisfied, perhaps both sides are partly dissatisfied, one in which one side or the other eminently wins is going to bring home a retribution later.
So David, one of your predecessors is said to have written in the 17th century, I believe, this definition of an ambassador: an honest man sent to lie abroad for the good of his country. Would you bring that up to
Yes,
date
indeed.
for the 20th century?
Well, Sir Francis Wotton, although
Yes.
admittedly he put it in Latin, where there isn't a pun. And by the way, this is rather an important point. In fact, I could go on with it. To lie abroad, this is the point about diplomacy, because it was only in the 17th century that you began to have permanent missions abroad. And it was in the 17th century, it was really Richelieu who discovered the point that diplomacy is a continuous process. It goes on in good times and bad. And so he should be, as I say, abroad. But on the point of duplicity, that's all stuff. Speaking the honest truth is so much better. It's often cleverer, too. And if you think this sounds a bit too British, it's thoroughly French, because Caillard, who is the greatest of all writers on diplomacy in the 18th century, he has a long passage on this, says there is nothing that comes home so surely as a lie that is discovered. And any lie, whether it's discovered or not, leaves a trace of poison in the negotiations. I'm not quoting him exactly. But this, I think, is the vital thing. Straightforward, and don't be too obfuscating. You see, the object of diplomacy is to arrive at an agreement, whatever it may be. It may be unimportant or important. Now, if you've got an agreement, agreements are made in words, and you must get the words right. And if you've got them right, then you can be fairly sure, assuming both sides accept the formula, that they'll stick to it. Now, if you make it too dashed vague, then either side can interpret it how it likes. There are many examples.
Then, do I interpret you correctly that in your experience, you never found yourself in conflict between the role of acting in accordance with the instructions of your government and acting in accordance with your intellectual standards as a scholar?
As it happens, I never did. I can, I suppose, conceive of such a position arising. There have been cases of colleagues who've told me that they very nearly decided to resign when they had instructions they didn't care for. But then they, I would say, even in that case, which has never arisen in my experience, even in that case, you want to think. Don't forget, the people at the headquarters are seeing the whole picture. You're only seeing a part of it. You feel very strongly that in relations between your country and the country in which you are serving, you feel convinced that course A is right and course B is all wrong. But there may be arguments taken from the picture as a whole which commend course B to the people at home.
One of the problems that arise today for diplomats and statesmen is they're dealing with the people. They have to come back to the voters. And I want to ask you about your characterization of the diplomatic process in our times, where politicians have to report to the people the terms that they have negotiated, often oversell the agreements to win the public support. What sort of problems does that pose for the ideals of diplomacy as you discuss them?
Right. Well, I think I can answer that. I'll go a little bit deeper, if I may. President Wilson, bless his heart, talked about open governments openly arrived at. Although when he actually got to Versailles, or when he actually got to Paris, he discovered this was perfectly compatible from sitting down with the other four, all by themselves in one room, with the United States Marines with fixed bayonets preventing anybody getting in and seeing what was going on. But anyway, nobody now believes in open diplomacy. Now, the vital thing is, though, open foreign policy. Now, this is simply common sense. Even if you're buying a house, you do this sort of thing. The negotiations should be in secret, because if the public knows every bid you're making, then then you're stuck with it. You get fixed into rigid attitudes. And I'll give you a very good example. We've had 35 years of diplomacy since the end of the last war, more, and what have been the two principal achievements? I will say they are the Austrian State Treaty and the Agreement on Trieste. Now, both of these were negotiated in absolute secret, and they both took, well, one took 8 years and the other took 5. And second, finally, of course, there has never been any disagreement about them later. Right. Now, but you must have open foreign policy in a diplomacy, in a democracy. You can't have anything else, because the people has got to ratify their decision. Therefore, the negotiators have got to say to themselves, this is the best in the interests of our two countries, or at least the least worst, but we must also put as good a face on it as we can, because otherwise, at least if you're a democracy, otherwise it won't stick. And this is, diplomats don't live in ivory towers, they do take into firm account what democracy will stand for.
Early in your career, you served as secretary to 2 prime ministers. Did your academic career prepare you sufficiently for the high politics that you encountered in that role? What surprised you?
can't very well say it prepared me, but I don't think it did me any harm. I think probably to have read Aristotle was a considerable advantage, though I can't remember actually quoting it. Oh, I do remember quoting Plato, though, to Churchill. Churchill was a man, sorry, this is an anecdote as an example of his fantastic memory. He suddenly said to me, all of a sudden, he was writing a speech. When he was writing a speech, he had everybody sitting around him, listening to what he was saying. And he said, where can I get the exact words of that quotation from Aristophanes, where he says that tragedy and comedy are very similar and should be written by the same person? So I said, oh, Prime Minister, I know it's Aristophanes. Surely you mean Aristotle? Oh, no, there are no prose works of Aristophanes, by the way. No, oh, no, it might be Plato, it might be Plato. Well, I'd been really taken by surprise by this, coming up apropos of absolutely nothing almost. But I did remember eventually, of course, Plato and the Symposium, where, I may say, it's said by Socrates to Aristophanes. Aristophanes is one of the fictitious characters in it. So I went, and in the cabinet room, rather agreeably, there's a complete set of the Loeb translations, editions of the classics. So I went and got the Symposium and showed him it, and he had got the words absolutely right. And I said, that's it, I remember that. I said, well, when do you remember that from, Prime Minister? And this must have been 52, let's say. He said, oh, well, I think it was just a little before the Boer War. Sorry, that's not a very relevant story. That's my only occasion I remember that classical education came immediately into view when I was at number 10. It is, you see, the job of the post of private secretary is a purely civil service appointment. It's not like in the United States or like in France, the chef de cabinet of the minister, and the same thing. In Germany, they have the same. It remains as an ordinary civil service. In fact, I remember Attlee telling me, talking about the Potsdam conference. He told me a story, he used to laugh like anything. Now, you probably don't remember. At Potsdam in 1945, the conference opened with Churchill as Prime Minister and Eden as Foreign Minister. And then halfway through, the British team left to go back to Britain because of the counting of the general election results, which had been delayed in order to get in the votes of the overseas voters. And it was, of course, a landslide victory for the Labour Party, and for the second half of the conference, only Attlee and Bevin came back. I should have said Attlee and Bevin were with Churchill and Eden as observers. And so the four of them went away, and only the two came back. And Attlee said to me, the Russians were very surprised, and the Americans were absolutely flabbergasted when I came back with the same private secretary that Churchill had gone away with. Now, you see, the Russians, that's fair, because they don't understand democratic elections. In fact, they were sure the thing was going to be rigged. They couldn't understand how Churchill had lost. They thought it was all going to be fixed. And Molotov kept saying to Attlee, you said you thought it might be a close thing. Now, look, you have a great majority. What has happened? They didn't understand a word of it. But, of course, the American tradition is when you throw the rascals out, you give the jobs to your friend. Ever since Leonid Marcy, remember, the Secretary of State, who was also responsible, I may remind you, for the dress ordinance.
Yeah, Stalin thought on that occasion that they handled things much better in Russia than the British did, because it was so confusing to change teams like that. But let me ask you something about Churchill personally. At the time you served him as his private secretary, you were with the Lion in winter. You've already told us how marvelous his memory was on that one point about the Greek classics. Did the Lion still have strong claws, and was there energy there, or did it just come in flashes? How did you find the man at that point in his life?
Well, I served him, you see, from October 51 until the end of 52, so that's a year and a bit. And at that time, I will repeat and maintain, he had his first stroke in 53. Up to the end of 52, or the beginning of 53, he was as good as anyone I've served for. Now, obviously, there was not the same pressure as there would have been in wartime. And I hope not. I think in peacetime, one should deliberate a long time on policies, and Churchill did like doing that. He liked to take his time. Attlee was very quick, very decisive. Churchill liked to get views from everybody, but he was still often very obstinate. No, I saw very little falling off. I mean, well, anyway, I hadn't known him before. Well, I had known him before, off and on. I'd met him when I was on Alexander's staff in Italy, and he came to see us there. I'd seen him once or twice then. But I didn't see any falling off, no.
And how would you compare the two, Attlee and Churchill, as decision makers?
Well, I had a party piece soon after I'd become, after the change of government, and I'd stayed with Churchill. I had a great party piece, and I'd say, everybody would ask me, say, what are they like? There must be a contrast. I'd, oh, terrible contrast. One, vigorous, decisive, take a decision in a flash like that. You see, the other one, more inclined to put things off, you know, and say, oh, I'll look at that later, or bring that down to Chartwell at the weekend. When I said Chartwell, which is Churchill's country house, you see, there'd be a great double take for the listener, because they all thought the indecisive one was Attlee. Not so. Attlee was very quick indeed. He would work at his papers, go through them, and perhaps he might ring up Ernest Bevin if he felt dubious, but usually he would say, very good, CRA, initial it. So then he'd say, well, I've finished all that, I'm going to bed, off he'd go. And this is very nice for the bureaucrat.
Yeah. In terms of domination of the cabinet, you give the impression that Attlee was dominating it more than Churchill was.
Oh, no question whatever. First of all, because Attlee had an unassailable position in the Labour Party because of all the trials he'd borne during the 30s, and he'd been faithful. Churchill, of course, had been in and out of the Conservative Party twice, as he once said. To rat is difficult, but to re-rat, when he changed again, you see, back to the Conservatives. So he didn't have quite the same control over them. And secondly, a matter of temperament, which is that Churchill did definitely have the artistic temperament, and he played things by ear, and he liked to get opinions and views from other people. Whereas Attlee, as I say, he would let them talk for a bit, never let them talk very long. He hated people who talked too long. And then he'd take his pipe out and he'd sort of wrap it on the ashtray, Hoosnicky pipe all the time, and said, oh, well, I think that's enough on that item, we must get on to the next one. Now, I think we're all agreed, the decision is, and then he'd say what it was, he'd say, and then he'd look round and say, right, item 2. And it wasn't always what they'd all agreed on, but it was very close to what he'd made up his mind beforehand. The other great contrast, of course, was that Attlee really was a conservative, and Churchill was a radical. He was Churchill liked change for the sake of change, and Attlee was, on the whole, inclined to stick to precedent.
Did the Prime Minister ever submit matters to a vote, or did the Prime Minister, both of them, just announce? I think the view is unstated.
You don't have votes in the cabinet, or very, very, very rarely. It's always done by consensus. And from time to time, normally speaking, you ought to let everybody speak, within reason, who wants to speak. And certainly both Attlee and Churchill would let them speak. Churchill would let them too long. But at the end, yes, it is usual for the Prime Minister to sum up. I have known votes taken, but it's very rare.
Is there one particular decision from that period that you remember that you'd like to share with us, your involvement either with Churchill or Attlee?
Well, what about Attlee and the Korean War? Because that came as an absolute surprise to us, both from the blue. And Attlee consulted with, it would be, I hope I'm right, I think it was early in the morning in London time when it started. And by lunchtime, Attlee had consulted with Bevan, had spoken to the American ambassador, had instructed the British ambassador to the United Nations, had decided in principle to send troops, and had laid on 2 battalions from Hong Kong. One of them was my old battalion, I may say, from the war, the 1st Welsh. And then that was pretty quick on the whole. He then had the cabinet in and told them what he'd decided. Nobody dissented. Nobody dissented, no. I'm not sure it was that afternoon when he had the cabinet. I think perhaps he did. If not, it was next morning.
During this period, well, even to the present, the American-British relationship has really been an important one. Were there any strains during these periods that you were there,
Not
that
when I
were
was
less, that were latent, that we might discuss? Or 'cause there is a much greater sense now of emerging tensions, not with the present government, of course, but with the labor on the nuclear issue. And we're seeing a lot in the British press about a review of that whole earlier period with regard to the British-American relationship with regard to nuclear weapons.
There was nothing of that in my time. They were very close indeed. Although Attlee, of course, had his argument when he thought he was let down over the Quebec Agreement on nuclear arms. The only time that Attlee went abroad when I was with him was to the United States, and the same thing with Churchill. No, that's not quite true. Churchill did go, Attlee did go abroad elsewhere, but I didn't go with him. The relationship between Attlee and Truman was extremely close. I may say they were very similar in character. They'd both been regimental officers in the First World War. I remember, because I came over at the time when, you might remember, in December 1950, there was considerable excitement after General MacArthur had suffered a defeat in Korea, and there was a lot of excitement, and somebody was talking about the use of nuclear weapons, and this worked people up a bit in Britain, and actually went there. His village was extremely welcome to Truman. There was an admirable man in my view. He was a splendid man. There was, in fact, really, there was rather a striking hiatus, I thought, when Truman went out and Eisenhower came in. Now, I happen to admire Eisenhower very much as a general. I think better of him as a general than many American, than all American military critics do. I think he was a very considerable general. Well, I can't talk about him as a president. Other Americans can make up their minds about that. But there certainly was, I was there, you see, at number 10, when there was a changeover, and there was a considerable hiatus. And I say Truman had been very decisive and quick, and Eisenhower, with his brand new administration, totally new personnel, took, I should have thought, about 6 months to pick up the reins. As far as foreign policy is concerned, no doubt he was doing all right in domestic policy.
Could I ask you a general question about the change in Britain's position in the period that you have been a British diplomat? I've got here in my hand The Economist of almost 4 years ago, June 1979. This was the issue in which they printed the farewell report of one of your distinguished colleagues, Sir Nicholas Henderson, when he was retiring from the Foreign Service. And he wrote this report to Dr. David Owen, who was then British Foreign Secretary. And his main point was that it was impossible, in his experience, to serve British interests abroad in a diplomatic capacity in a period of general decline in which economic decline was paramount. He cites productivity statistics, comparing Britain with France and Germany from 1954 over a 15-year period, and it is very much to Britain's disadvantage. What would be your comment on your problem representing British interests both in the Commonwealth and in non-Commonwealth countries in a period of general decline and particularly economic decline?
Well, naturally, it would be very much nicer if it wasn't an economic decline going on. But as the old Turkish proverb says, the soup is never drunk as hot as it's cooked. And so things often work out. You do your best for the country's interests. You see, you want to distinguish, or rather I will distinguish, if I may, between political and economic affairs.
Right.
Now, in my view, in my experience, the political side of the work is often either routine or impossible. Perhaps that's the number of different places I've served in. I have never, I regret to say, served in the United States, where a great measure of cooperation is possible. But on the economic side, you can quite often do something for the good of the country. And in my view, especially, for example, in places like Brazil, it is by far the most important thing I can do. I used to say to my staff, remember, it's British trade that pays our salaries. And this is, therefore, I think, one of the greatest things you can do. There was once a British ambassador in St. Petersburg in 1908 who sent a minute to his staff saying, please remember, I'm not here to concern myself with commercial matters. Now, he's as extinct as the Romanov dynasty. So that's very important. Now, since that time, the other thing is, of course, that there is a a movement. There is a sisterly and a disasterly in all human affairs, as Aristotle says. You know, yeah, a woman undergraduate in my time spelt it S-I-S-T-E-R-L-Y, and disasterly, D-I-S-A-S-T-E-R-L-Y. And so things go up and down, putting it a bit brighter, yes. Things go up and down, and for example, economically, we are now more on the up move and moving ahead of the continent of Europe, such as France and Germany. But in all times, good and bad, it's continuity of policy that counts. There is, of course, a very important lesson which Nico Henderson makes, which is that no country should try to do more than it can. But even so, a country of the second rank, like Britain or France, can still do a fair amount of good, both for itself and, for heaven's sake, for the rest of the world. Because it is, the good of the rest of the world is one of the things which we think is important element of British foreign policy, which is peaceful and
Are there any lessons from this period of the British management of its changing relationship to the world, a period of decline, that might be applicable to the American experience that you would like to share with us? Because one of the criticisms made of U.S. foreign policy is our incapacity to adjust to a changing world in which our relative power is not what it used to be.
I would put in a word for the United States Foreign Service, which is a marvelous service and containing some of the most expert and dedicated men I've ever met, but somehow or other it seems to become a principle of the United States Constitution that the Foreign Service should be treated as badly as possible, with people put over their heads and somebody cutting away their allowances because they're supposed to be striped pants cookie pushers. So I think that the advice from the American Foreign Service you've got will always have been very good indeed. Now, yes, there is indeed, we've had some very similar changes. And one of the most important things is to realize that when something has happened, that it has happened, and things will not be quite the same. And so you must not expect to have the same influence that you had in areas of the world where you have explicitly either withdrawn or limited your powers. There was a time, for example, when British and French influence in West Africa was very great, both commercially and politically, by a deliberate decision on the part of Britain and France. That predominance has been abandoned, and we now have to compete. Well, this is a very good thing, because it means that you are competing properly and doing your best and not being pampered by conditions. Although, of course, there always was a difference between the British and the French position in Africa, because the French were rigidly protectionist, and the British allowed entirely free trade. So there was no question of that we were competing with French and German and everything else before these countries became independent, and therefore we carried on doing so afterwards. This, I think, is the same kind of thing that may perhaps have applied to some extent in United States relations with Latin America. That the United States used to have a much greater influence than it has today, and have greater power to direct the policy of some of the governments of Latin America than it possesses today.
Hearing on that, Sir David, I notice you've spent a lot of your professional career in diplomacy in countries of the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Though not exclusively. And could you give us your views on the Commonwealth as a unique international association? I think our interest is in this question. To what extent is the Commonwealth united? Is there anything on which it's united? Or are the internal diversities so great that it's just an occasion for people who have something common in their background to get together and talk? But does it amount to more than that?
Well, there you are, you see. This is what people think. They think it's all done by millers. Well, there's something in it. There is no single item, I'm perfectly certain, which would unite the entire Commonwealth, from, let's say, Grenada to Malaysia. And the best I can say is this: it is a very remarkable thing that it's there at all, that countries which were at one time the objects of British imperialism should nevertheless have decided of their own free will to remain associated. That they have so decided must mean that they have an interest. There is a certain sentiment as well, but of course some sentiment works the other way. It does not have a common view, but it's extraordinary that they all come together. They all come and meet. When you have the Commonwealth Heads of Governments meeting, nobody stays away making rude noises. They come along and make useful contributions to discussions. Now, as far as the British are concerned, it is convenient for us and a help in our diplomacy that through the Commonwealth we have access to important countries in all the continents of the world, who, through whom we can be up to date and from whom we get a slightly different view than we should get from our people in, well, from the ordinary sort of diplomatic intercourse. Some people say that the root of the Commonwealth is the professional linkage. Educationalists, scientists, doctors, chiropodists, for all I know, they all have been brought up in the same way. And I suppose the best thing to say is what Crispy said about Italy, that whatever unites is better than what disunites. It may not be very important, but it's something.
You mentioned earlier your experience in Latin America. I wonder if we might talk about the British response to the Falklands-Malvinas crisis. Was it a great moment for British nationalism and also for British diplomacy, or was it a tragedy and failure for the international community? What are your reflections there?
It was certainly not a great moment for British nationalism, I don't think. Don't forget, you see, I come from the diplomatic service, and it will be no secret to any of you that the diplomatic service placed the value of the Falklands very low indeed. In fact, some of the ruder people in Britain would say that the diplomatic service was trying to sell them off at any price, at a knockdown price. Well, I don't entirely agree with that. I think one of the factors you've got to take into account, and it's a very important one, was the United Nations resolution. Here is a mandatory resolution of the Security Council, one of the very few ones, condemning Argentine aggression and ordering the withdrawal of Argentine troops from the area. Now, this is unusual. It has happened in the case of Cyprus, I may say, and Turkey didn't pay any attention to that. But it's really only Turkey and Argentina that have had the same resolution against them. Now, this is very important in Britain because the attachment to the principles of the United Nations is very widespread. And without that, I don't think we should have had anything like the same unanimity on the necessity of taking steps to cancel the Argentine aggression. I'm perfectly certain that this was the case. It obviously unites both the government and the opposition. The opposition in the original debate on the 3rd of April was immediately after the invasion, after the Argentines had captured the islands, in fact. The opposition was taking a strongly nationalist line. I have a feeling perhaps they thought they could catch the government out on this. And so there was a great unanimity, which was enormously reinforced by the United Nations resolution.
Could I ask you something on that very point about the United Nations resolution? And you referred earlier to Attlee's government's decision to participate in the Korean War, where
Yes.
the North Koreans attacked South Korea. We remember that General MacArthur commanded the forces against the North Koreans as United Nations commander,
Correct.
as well as U.S. commander.
Yeah.
And the United Nations flag flew at his headquarters.
Yep.
How would it have been for Britain's position politically in the international world if Mrs. Thatcher had asked for an international peacekeeping force in which the major contribution would be British, with American and some Latin American countries contributing? So it would have been a UN operation and not solely a British operation.
Well, I don't entirely agree with that. I think what Britain should have done, and what Britain should have done, is to have taken a strongly, strongly nationalist line. And I think what Britain should have done is to have taken a strongly nationalist line. And I think what Britain should have done is to have taken a strongly nationalist line. remember that Mrs. Thatcher, I think rather bravely, accepted the Peruvian plan, which would have involved the United Nations taking charge, with the British and the Argentine flag flying. Now, I've heard a lot of people say that if General Galtieri had had the sense to accept it also, he might very well have brought down Mrs. Thatcher's government, because I'm afraid it's not, wasn't very popular in Britain, the idea of an Argentine flag, an Argentine contingent on the island. I think, Mark, I think the British would have gone along with it if Galtieri had accepted, but he very foolishly would have nothing to do with it. He refused to negotiate at all, in fact. We, as I say, Mrs. Thatcher, even, and she is supposed to be a very strong woman, accepted this plan. He would negotiate on the basis, she accepted the plan, whereby there would be a United Nations flag flying in the British and Argentina at the same time, and contingents from Britain and Argentina and other things. This was the Peruvian plan. So I think it was risky of her to accept it, but she did, and thereby I can't help feeling she put herself into right with international law all round.
Were there any disappointments in the American role in that crisis, or do you think we acted as well as we could, being caught between a rock and a hard place?
I believe so, yes, I believe so. I think that the efforts by Secretary of State Haig were very much appreciated in London, in Britain. I say, don't forget, of course, you know, I'm a retired ambassador from ages ago. I'm not talking with authority. I'm speaking as a man in the street in Britain. I'm reporting on what British opinion to my mind was. Yes, I believe that all intelligent British people were of the view that the United States were trying to find a way out of the impasse, that it was very good of them to try. They thought that he was totally frustrated by the intransigence of Galtieri, which, in fact, I think he was. I will excuse Galtieri because he had to show an intransigent face, otherwise he would be overthrown by another putsch, because the system of government in Argentina is rotten, if I may say so.
I think we would agree with you on that. Sir David, the authority with which you speak the wisdom of being retired. Because I feel myself now being American. While we were on Latin America, let me ask you something about Brazil, where you served as ambassador, and I think it was when at that time the military, of course, were in control, as they are still in Brazil today. And if I'm interpreting it correctly, what you observed was an economy galloping ahead in development at very rapid speed, while political repression is being maintained and the people are driven and being oppressed politically. There is no political freedom. The fragile constitutionalism of the Vargas period had been brutally suppressed. How do you view this contrast between the political dictatorship and the rapid economic development? Were the economic gains worth the political price?
It all depends. I think perhaps I won't necessarily dissent from you with what you say about the Brazilian situation, but you've got to remember that Brazil, in contrast with other Latin American countries, had one great contrast, of course, and it's the only Portuguese-speaking one, and they're all a bit molle. The other ones consider that they're a bit on the soft side, and so in Brazil nothing is ever quite pushed to extremes. When I was there, they were having elections to the Congress. They were having, they had a reasonable amount of participation in government. It wouldn't do for Britain and it wouldn't do for the United States. But people were, on the whole, not as bad as all that. Things went along softly. One thing I objected to most, I suppose, was the suppression of the trade unions, but even there were some sindicatos that kept things going. But as I say, in Brazil, in contrast to some of the more masculine-minded Spanish-speaking Latin American countries, they take things easy. Don't forget, they abolished capital punishment about 120 years ago. They haven't executed anybody for 130 years. They can't bear it. And when ambassadors were kidnapped, and I was very nearly kidnapped, they were all They're always ready to give way to the demands of the kidnapper straight off.
I worked in Brazil for a year for the United Nations before the time you were there. I agree in what you're saying about Molly, but we both remember that during the period of the military dictatorship, there was the linea dura, the hard line among the military. There were off-duty police officers reported to be responsible for murders and mysterious disappearance of people who were never found. So there was a substratum of brutality and violence.
Well, I don't want to particularly to apologize to the Brazilian government at that time, although I got on well enough with them. But I will take you up on the second point, the Esquadrón de Morte. This was indeed true. Off-duty policemen, as you put it, would from now go around the place murdering people. But that had no connection whatsoever with politics or ideology.
Really?
Not a scrap. No, all the people who were murdered were people who were drug traffickers who hadn't paid up enough in bribes. There were people who were prostitutes. It was a sort of morality lark. I know, sir, with great respect, there is no doubt about this, because, you see, the whole point about the Esquadrón de Morte, the death squad, was that the victims must be found, and they always were found, riddled with bullets, and on his breast, on the chest of the victim, was a paper saying, I was a pimp, I was a thief, I sold drugs, and so on and so forth. Never I was a subversivo. Never they said I was subversive or anything. And secondly, the opposition, of course we had the urban guerrillas in those days, never complained about the Esquadrón de Morte. They never said any of their people had been killed by it. In fact, none of them ever was. And to clinch the matter, all the victims were blacks. And of course the people who were engaged in subversive activities were all white. They were all indeed from the best families in Rio. Many a time I've been dining in Rio society, knowing very well that the son or perhaps the daughter of the house had been keeping an eye on my gates to work out my movements so they could kidnap me.
You suggested earlier that one of the changes in the world was the loss, the relative decline of American influence in places like Latin America, for example. Do you envision greater competition, friendly competition between the United States and its allies in places like Latin America, for example, where interests diverge, we see more economic competition, we see more disagreement about what should be done with regard to revolution, for example, in Central America. This seems to be a tension eating away at some of the more stronger foundations of the alliances we've known it.
I should hope to see greater economic competition in Latin America, because I'm in favor of competition in trade in any event. Secondly, I should like the British to get a bit more of it. And the Latin Americans themselves are very anxious that there should be competition, especially economic competition, because, well, for reasons which you can produce from any manual of American political and economic science, that competition is good for the consumer. So that this I should very much favor. I don't see any reason whatever for competition for political influence in Latin America. I don't think it takes place. And I don't, well, cultural influence, yes. And for example, the French are competing very hard to try to restore the position that French language and French culture had in the 19th century. Because in Argentina and Brazil, for example, the second language of society was French. Now it is, now the older generation, charming lot they are too, do still talk in French, and the younger ones have English as their second language.
Another area of the world that was important in your career, of course, was Africa. You coined the phrase, "the wind of change is blowing," which Macmillan used. In retrospect and drawing on your wisdom as a retired diplomat, what are your views on the disappointments that emerged in Africa after the transition? Or is that too negative a view? How do you look back on the way Britain saw the new realities of the world in Africa?
Well, one of the important things, of course, was that we decided, it was a decision by the government, it was put through, I may point out, by a Conservative government, although first thought up by a Labour government, was that we had no right to be ruling in Africa, that it was not in our interests, and not long afterwards the same decision was come to by de Gaulle. There have been disappointments, I suppose. Everybody always quotes Idi Amin, whom I knew in Africa. I may just put in I don't want to put in a word for him, but I will point out that he was perhaps in the lower quartile of African rulers, but there have been worse. The worst of the very lot was Matthias Nguema in Equatorial Guinea. He is a very spectacular example, but because his second language was Spanish and had been a Spanish colony, and he wasn't a member of the Commonwealth, nobody ever heard about it until he was eventually overthrown. But he was a man, he destroyed something like a third of the population and the whole of the wealth of the country.
And the French had Bokassa to their
And
credit.
there was Jean Bokassa yes, well, all right. What about Burundi?
Yeah.
Far more people were murdered in Burundi than ever were murdered in Uganda. And what about Ethiopia? The Derg has been very brutal, murdered plenty of people there. And so it goes on, I'm afraid. Well, it can't be helped, as I say. The world lives as it will do, and there have been cases of strong men coming to the top and imposing this kind of rule.
But with regard, again, to the British experience, was there any underlying reflection that you would like to share with us about the way power was passed and
I think it was done very well, and it was done at the right time. It was done correctly. A lot of people have complained that we imposed on them, which we didn't impose anything, a Westminster-type constitution that wasn't really suited for Africans. And they ought to have done much better to have had a United States-type constitution, which I have, of course, the greatest admiration. But people forget that in countries like Nigeria or Uganda, which are the two I know most intimately, suppose the colonial office, they did think of doing this, had said to them, oh, you don't want all the elaborate business we have, you see. Wouldn't you like something much simpler with an executive president and so on? The Africans would have been horrified. They would have said, what's this kind of inferior constitution they're going to try to pass off on us? Because they'd all been brought up to believe that the British constitution was the finest in the world. And so they all insisted on every detail of it, the speaker in a wig and the parliament and the mace and all the rest of it. They dropped it after a bit, of course, but it wasn't our fault that we started them off with it. They wouldn't have had anything else. And the answer, the real thing is, of course, that it was the time for Africa to be free. And if since then some countries have misused their freedom, well, that has happened in other parts of the world too. The great mass of them have done very well indeed, and I think highly of them, all of them. And in fact, I'm very attached to the continent of Africa and all my friends there.
So David, I wonder if I could switch the conversation to a very broad area of speculation. But it involves your own expertise as a classical scholar and archaeologist, which we know you've written, published many things. You've studied the history of the early civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, Minoan and classical Greece. You've studied the rise and the decline of that civilization. Applying that to the problem of Western civilization today, there are all kinds of arguments, you know, as to at what stage of our development we are. Are we still rising, climbing, in Toynbee's phrase, to a peak we haven't yet attained? Are we at a plateau and have leveled off, or are we already on the decline? Is our peak as a civilization behind us? Comparing what you remember in the studies of the past, where would you put us, our position today?
Well, I will begin by saying that although I met Toynbee and I read his book several times, large parts of it with great amusement, I don't believe a word of it. I'm not a believer in the rise of civilizations and the decline. That's exactly the same with Spengler, which I remember reading when I was very young, when I first year at Oxford, and being very impressed, but I don't believe in it. I think we are, it depends what we mean by we. There are today in the let's stick to Europe and the North America.
Right.
There are in these areas as many educated, as many cultured people, as many people with the highest values of civilization as there ever were. There are also, no doubt, a very large number still of people who are rather wicked and not very intelligent. There are, I think, a rather larger number of the, what you might call the middle class of the intellect than there have been in the past. Now, really, I suppose, especially talking before television, I ought to be saying something about the decline in reading and the way in which the machines have taken over. I don't know if it's true. I don't find it in myself. And I'm not sure that I find it in most of the people I mix with. I think that we are now on a stage where material prosperity keeps on increasing. Say it did in the late Palace Age and the Minoan time.
Yes.
But I don't see the menace that's going to destroy it unless the whole lot is destroyed straight away. It certainly won't be overthrown by the internal proletariat or anything of that sort. The proletariat, on the contrary, is getting more bourgeoisified every day. So, I think that I shall say that I believe modern times are just as good as the old ones, even though, of course, when one thinks of one's youth, one does tend to think that the sun shone a bit more brightly then.
But let me ask you this further question. Would you say we are, at this period in the 20th century, as creative as we once were? This was a creative civilization, let us say, from the 17th century through the 19th. In ethical development, political invention, technological development, philosophy, ideas, and influence in the world, are we still creating, or are we resting on our oars?
It seems to me that in some things we are still creating, in other things we're not doing as well as all that. And philosophy is a very good example. Now, the new systems of philosophy, new patterns, this last 50 years of my life have been immensely creative, and all of them are stimulating. I don't think, naturally, they can't all be right, but there has been nothing like it, I think, even in the 17th century. In the field of art, some people argue one way and some argue another. I'm not so sure. I think it is perhaps rather a poor period. In architecture, I'm sure it's rather a poor period, although it's rather attractive. It's one in which appearance has completely dominated function, so that I think the buildings look nice, but they're awful to live in. Let me see now, what are we getting at? General civilized life. And the amenities of life, I believe that we are going on and getting better and better. And in literature, well now, literature is a thing that ebbs and flows. You have the most wonderful periods of creativity, and then all of a sudden it drops completely away. Look at French literature in the 18th century, for example, and British in, well, let's say the first half of the 20th century. And so, and I don't think I'm all that competent to say much about it. In the sciences, there are discoveries, I think especially of medical research,
Yes.
discoveries which are astonishing in their quality. Yes, I think it's a very good century. It's been a bit too warlike for my liking. I'm sorry to have had to spend 7.5 years in the army. But apart from that, we've had a nice long period of peace now.
And I presume that diplomacy will continue to be able to hold it all together in this coming era. Are you confident about that? That is, the tensions between these
It is diplomacy that will have to do it in any event. And diplomacy is something that can never be done without, simply because there are large numbers of different nations in the world, and they all must have relations with each other. The Tibetans were the last ones that tried not to have any relations with anybody else, and it didn't do them any good. Because, as the great Mr. Dooley said, you can refuse to love a man, you can refuse to lend him money, but if he wants to fight, you've just got to oblige.
Well, on that happy note, with a quotation from that important American prophet, Mr. Dooley, Sir David, thank you very much for being with us here today. It was a great honor to listen to you, to hear your reflections on this period and the future of diplomacy and of the world we ended up on there. Professor Lipson, thank you very much for joining us. And
My
thank
pleasure.
you very much for joining us on Open Window.
Most enjoyable indeed.
We hope that you've enjoyed an open window and that you'll join us each week for a look at people and events on the Berkeley campus. Your comments and suggestions would be valuable to us in planning future programs. Our address is an open window, Educational Television, University of California, Berkeley 94720. Thank you for watching.